Well, we've just taken delivery of two 23,000 litre water tanks that's going to give us 10 times the water storage we've been working with so far. Essential to living off-grid is water storage, and these tanks are going to be a lifesaver come summertime. So we've got a few jobs ahead of us today. We're going to bring the excavator over and walk these tanks further up the hill. We've got to do all the fittings and outlets. Now, I've had these tanks delivered without any of the fittings installed, because how we configure the inlets and outlets is going to help us deal with the mineral content in our bore water. I'll explain a bit more about that as we go. But first jobs first, let's work out how far up the hill we can get them. So we've got some poly pipe that we need to roll out. That's going to determine the position that we dig a pad in the hill for these tanks to sit on, and the further up the hill we get them, the more gravity is going to assist that water pressure, and the better the water pressure, the better our showers. So let's get to rolling some poly pipe out. Well, check out this complicated configuration of water lines, but this is what I need to figure out. So I'm going to disconnect all of this and see how far these other two lines go. So the first line we stretched out was our water up line, that's coming up the hill from the bore. This one's our water down line, or our main supply water to our tiny home and buildings. And this little one is our overflow line. So we've set it up in such a way that when the tanks reach the top, it overflows and goes back down to the dam. Essentially, every time we fill our tanks, we're also topping up our dam. But I need to see just how far these lines stretch. And while we're here, check out just how yellow our tanks are getting. That's due to that mineral content that I was talking about. It's hydrogen sulfide. It's not incredibly toxic unless it was in really high doses, and most of it gets filtered out just in the process of kind of aerating it and pumping it up the hill. But I really want to get rid of a lot more of that content, and I've got an idea on how we can do that. Okay, onto the box of goodies. Our local plumbing supply place put this order together for me, and I've already found one little mistake, and that is I ordered extra tank fittings and didn't realize that the tanks, which come from a separate company, come with their own fittings, and these are awesome brass fittings. So that was a little bit of a waste of money, but around here on a Homestead, these will always be put to use eventually. So let's check and see exactly what we got. So tank fittings, I don't need the poly ones. We're going to use the brass ones. They also delivered the tanks with these awesome 2-inch ball valves. So these are metal ball valves. They're going to just last forever. Don't put the PVC ball valves out in the sun. You know, those white ones with the red handle? Put them in a valve box by all means. Put them inside, but don't leave them sitting out in the sun. That little red handle just breaks right off eventually. So that's going to connect to there. I've got little joiners for our overflow line, which is in 1 inch or 25 mil. I think it's called 1 inch when you're doing it in rural line, and I think it's called 25 mil when you're doing it in blue line. I don't know why we don't just stick to one standard. All right, this one is a fancy float valve. So a normal float valve, you just screw into the side of your tank, water comes out there. When the arm is in the up position, it closes off that valve. And the arm is raised into that up position with a float that sits out on the end of like a plastic or a metal arm. But this one has a weight and a float so that I can set a minimum and a maximum. So when it starts filling and when it stops filling. And that's going to be important for this idea that I've got to deal with our mineral content. I need a little bit of splash room. I need a little bit of headroom at the top of the tank. This should be, yeah. This is called a square D pressure switch, and essentially I'm going to be able to install this down at the pump and have it come on and off depending on the pressure that it senses in the line. I'll explain how all that works when we set it up. Well, welcome to the junk side of the tiny home that we don't really ever show you. It's not really junk, it's kind of where all the utilities go. I mean, obviously you've got important things like beer bottling, and then we've got our gas for our hot water system. All of our utilities like our water, gas and power are all connected back here. So as part of this tanks hookup project, what I really wanted to do is move where our water pump is. Where our tiny home was first situated when we built it, it made sense to have the water pump right at that far end, but now my water tanks are in that direction, so I think I want to get the water pump connected here under the hot water system, and that way the best water pressure in the house is right next to where the shower is. Okay, tanks are in place, they look great, the pads worked out perfectly. I know I've got more than enough polypipe to get to this location, so now it's just about getting it all hooked up. The openings are right here and here, nice and close to each other, and I want to do all my fittings within reaching distance of the openings. Number one, it's going to make it easier to do my top fittings because I'm just reaching into the tank that way, but also anytime I need to check on them, I'm basically just looking straight down the hole. And so you can bottom fill a tank, but we're going to put our inlets up high on the tank. And the reason for that is, as I said before, we've got some mineral content in our bore water or well water that we need to deal with. Now we've got iron and we've got manganese, but the one I really want to deal with through aeration is hydrogen sulfide. And hydrogen sulfide is that rotten egg smell that you sometimes get in well water or bore water. Now it's not, I mean, it's toxic in high doses, but it's not in any kind of quantities here in our water that we need to be worried about. But essentially blending it with oxygen or oxidizing it is going to turn that hydrogen sulfide into sulfates that are going to be suspended in the water, and the gas component of it, or that rotten egg smell, is going to dissipate in the air. So what's going to be really important is that I have some headroom in my tank between the top of the tank where the inlet is and the level of the water, so that it actually splashes and aerates and bubbles as it fills the tank. And that's where that minimum, maximum or high-low float valve that we bought is going to come into play. So I'm only ever filling my tank when I've got a nice amount of splash room. So first things first, we're going to get our inlets on. I'm going to put an inlet at the top of this tank and then an inlet at the top of that tank. And here's how it's also going to work. Down at the bottom of the tanks is where I'm going to do my outlets. Now on this first tank, the outlet position is going to be pretty important. So that aeration that's happening at the top is dealing with that hydrogen sulfide, but that's a pretty light mineral and it's going to stay suspended in the water, and so it's going to carry across to the next one as well. Ultimately, the only way we can deal with those sulfates that are left over from that aeration oxidation process is to put a filter on. And I've already got an under sink filter for all of our drinking water, but the heavier minerals like iron and manganese have the ability, or will, settle to the bottom of the tank. So what I don't want to do is pick them up by putting my outlet right at the bottom of the tank. So I've got to make a decision between, I'm going to lose some storage capacity the further up the tank I put the outlet, but I'm going to have the ability to create a settling tank in this first tank. So those heavier minerals, they'll sink to the bottom. Every 2 or 3 years we'll get in and clean this tank out. It'll have a layer of sludge and mineral content on the bottom, but then that water's going to come out of this tank, up into the top of the next tank. A little bit more aeration happens again, just in case there's a little bit more of that hydrogen sulfide that needs oxidizing, and then we'll do the final outlet at the bottom of the second tank, and that's where the water then goes down to the tiny home gardens animals. So I can either put it at this level here or here. In the past, my experience, and I've dealt with particularly heavy iron content in the water, the layer of sludge or slime you get is about that thick. So I don't really want to waste all of that, because that's probably about maybe 1/10 of my water storage in here. That's a good maybe 2,000 litres of water that I'm just not going to be able to store. So I was going to put it up on this rib here, but I think I'll get it as high on that one as I possibly can. If I find out later on down the track that I was better off putting it here, I can just put another outlet on the tank. Now, you may be wondering, how am I going to get in there to do the back of that connection up? And the old Regan used to climb inside the tanks to do the connections, because that's what made sense to me, until a plumber friend of mine saw me doing it on a post online and said, you know, you should Google it, Regan. There's another way to do those. So shout out to Will. Thanks for making me do the research, but I did figure it out. The easiest way to install that there is with a bit of wire. All right, I'm going to make a little hook at the bottom. Let's go fishing. There we go. right, just before I tell you how the installation went and what we got up to and what we've got left to do, can I ask a huge favor? If you've enjoyed this video and you want to see our videos on the regular, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and the little bell notification. That'll tell you whenever one of our videos come out, but I'll tell you right now, it's every Friday evening. And if you like the video, hit the thumbs up for us. Most people don't actually do that, and I'll admit I never used to either, but as a starting out YouTuber, I realized just how much it helps YouTube to take us seriously as content creators. And that's part of our overall strategy of being out here, starting a homestead and sharing the journey with you. I feel a bit weird for asking, but if you could do that, that'd really help us out. All right, so where'd we get up to on the installation? Well, we pretty much got it finished and we did our first pump up last night from the bore up to the tanks, and we got about a third of tank number 1 filled. So we're only gonna operate off of tank 1 for the first few days until we start overflowing into tank number 2. We didn't end up using those brass tank fittings. You might have noticed that, and that's literally only because it was slightly larger than my largest hole saw. And if you saw how thick that plastic was, I wasn't gonna be there carving it out with a knife. So we ended up using the black poly fittings. That's fine. I'm sure those brass fittings are worth something. I might sell them on Marketplace. Now, the two components that we didn't end up installing yet, because we don't need them just yet, are that high-low float valve and that square D pressure switch. So the way a square D pressure switch works is it's an electrical component with a mechanical mechanism inside of it that when the pressure builds up in the line, it activates a mechanical component that disconnects the electrical circuit. So essentially, it stops power going to the pump when the pressure in the line is too high. So when that float valve would close, pressure would build up in the line, pump stops running. And that's really important. You don't want your pump running on a closed line or you're gonna burn it out. Now, the reason none of that's important just yet, and that we'll install that a little bit later on down the track, is what we're mainly relying on right now is our overflow line. So we did get to installing that overflow line, and that means if, and we're going to, we pump up more water than we use every day, so more than 100%, we are going to end up flowing water back down that overflow line, and instead of going back down into our bore, it's actually gonna go down into our dams. Our dams are a part of the larger ecosystem of our entire homestead, and we want to do some things to take responsibility for those water systems ecologically speaking. For example, we'd love to add fish into the system, but we can't do that yet until we've got a good volume of water, until we're sustaining a good volume of water in the dams. We'll add some native species of fish, and that'll bring greater biodiversity to our water systems. It'll help control pests like mosquitoes in our dam. It'll help control algal bloom outbreaks, and just ultimately increase that biodiversity, which is better for all the flora and fauna on our property, including us. We're fauna. Ultimately, of course, more water storage is so that we can do critical activities like watering our homestead gardens. And I want to be able to do this guilt-free without worrying that I'm emptying the last little bit of water out of the tanks and cutting in on someone's shower. So I'm going to enjoy watering my garden. And until next time, we'll see you on the next video.